lesson we'll be learning about pawns, and the first thing we're going to learn is how to set them up at the start of the game. As you can see, we have 8 white pawns on the second row, and that's where we put them at the start of the game. And black has 8 pawns also, and they go on the 7th rank. Now, how do pawns move? Well, that's an interesting question, because pawns at the start of the game, when they are in their starting position, they can move either 1 square forward or 2 squares forward. It's entirely up to you to decide. Okay, so for example, I'm going to move my E pawn 2 squares forward like that. And now it's black's turn, and he too has the option of moving any of his pawns either 1 square forward or 2 squares forward. And he's going to choose to move this pawn, his C pawn, 1 square forward like that to C6. So white's turn again. And now, since this pawn is no longer in its starting position, that means that pawn can only advance 1 square at a time, whereas all the other pawns can move forward either 1 or 2 squares. Okay, so white's going to move his F pawn 2 squares like that, and now black can move any of his pawns either 1 square or 2 squares forward, except for his C pawn, because that pawn is no longer in its starting position. Let me explain this a little bit better. Okay. Now, if pawns are on the green lines, they can advance 1 or 2 squares forward. But if they're anywhere else, if they're on any of those yellow squares, they can only advance 1 square at a time. I hope this diagram makes things a little bit clearer. Now, pawn captures are a little bit more difficult than other captures because pawns do not capture like they move forward. However, they capture diagonally. Okay, so like this. And now look at that pawn over there on E5. If pawns capture the way other pieces do, the pawn on E4 could take on E5, but that's not the case, okay? Pawns capture diagonally, so that means only the pawn on D4 can take the one on E5. So pawns capture diagonally, 1 square away only, okay? 1 square away. So it's white to move now, and he can move any of those pawns, either 1 square or 2 squares. The E pawn cannot move, it's blocked. Okay, and so is black's pawn on E5, and black can do the same, and that's how pawns capture diagonally. Okay, and the same for black. Okay, let's move on. And we're going to see some more examples of captures. Now the pawn on C4, the white pawn on C4 can take the one on D5, but he decides not to, and he advances his D pawn instead. And now again, black can take on C4. His D pawn can take the one on C4, but he decides to move this one here. And now it's a little bit confusing because the one on D4 can take the one on C5, or the one on C4 can take the one on D5, but instead white chooses this move. And now again, black has the option of taking on C4, or the C pawn can take on D4 or B4. Okay, I'm just going to set up a position with pawns right in front of each other like that. Okay, now the pawn on A4 can take the one on B5 if we choose to. Okay, or the B pawn can capture any of those 2 pawns because pawns capture diagonally. The C pawn can capture any of those pawns, the one on B5 or the one on D5. White's D pawn can take the one on C5 if he wants to. And if it were black's turn, the pawn on A5 could take the one on B4, or the one on B5 could take any of those 2 pawns. The one on C5 can take on B4 or on D4. The one on D5 can take the one on C4. Okay, I hope that's made things a little bit clearer. Now, something else about pawns. What happens when the pawn gets to the end of the board? Okay, does it stay there? What happens to it? Is it like touchdown, or what exactly happens? Well, we're going to look at that. Okay, both pawns are advancing, and watch what happens when I get the pawn over here. I get to pick any of those pieces. Okay, the pawn is promoted, and it becomes any piece that we want. Normally we'll pick the queen because it's the most valuable piece, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to pick the queen. So that pawn becomes a queen. And now when black's pawn gets to the other end, he can do it the same, okay? He can choose which piece he wants. It's not going to make much of a difference because the white queen is on the same diagonal, and that means the white queen is going to take the black queen, okay? So that's what happens when our pawns get to the other end of the board. They become any piece that we want, okay? It must be of the same color, and we can only choose either a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. We can't pick another pawn, and we can't pick the king, okay, for obvious reasons. So let's move on and let's see some examples of positions where getting a piece other than a queen makes sense. But before we do that, I wanted to show you this position because maybe you're wondering how many queens can you have on the board? What's the most queens you can have on the board of the same color? And the answer to that is 9 queens, okay? Because we've got a queen at the start of the game, and then each one of our pawns could, in theory, become a queen. I mean, I've never seen it happen. I mean, you know, normally I've seen games where you get 2 queens for each side, but anything other than that, it's very unusual because normally someone gets checkmated before that happens. But here, white's got 9 queens, which is, as I said, incredibly unusual, and I don't think it'll ever happen in a serious game. No way. Okay, so under promotion, why would we get a piece other than a queen? Well, take a look at this position. If we get a queen, okay, when the pawn is promoted, this king has nowhere to go because all those squares are attacked by white pieces. So that means that king has nowhere to go. But this is not checkmate because the king is not in check. So if the king is not in check, how could it be checkmate? No, this position is a stalemate, so that means the game ends in a draw. I'll be explaining stalemate later on, okay? So that's what happens if we get a queen here. So instead of getting a queen, what we're going to do is we're going to get a rook. And since the rook doesn't move diagonally, that means this king can still move to a6. But when it does, the white rook comes to a8, and this position really is checkmate. Okay, because the king has nowhere to go, the king is under attack, and he can't go to any of those squares because the white king is controlling them. Okay, so as you can see in the starting position, it makes sense to get a rook rather than a queen. We're going to see another example. Now, in this position, black threatens to take our bishop, so if we get a queen, okay, he's just going to take our bishop, and then both sides have a queen, and it's going to be a draw. Okay, so instead of that, white does something very unusual. Okay, he gets a knight. Okay, the pawn, when he gets to the other end, becomes a knight and attacks the king because that's a check, and the queen is also under attack. That's the interesting thing about knights. They can attack several targets simultaneously. Okay, so that means the king's got to move, and then we take the queen. And white is winning now because a bishop and a knight with the king, they can deliver checkmate. It takes a while, but once you learn it, it's not that difficult. Okay, let's move on. There's something else I wanted to tell you about, and it's the en passant rule. Okay, the en passant rule is very interesting because we've said that pawns cannot take pawns sideways, cannot take other pieces sideways. They only capture diagonally. So how is it possible the white pawn can now take the c pawn like this? Okay, and this is the en passant rule. The en passant means in passing, is a French word. And as you can see, when black's pawn moves to c5, it does cross a square, which in theory is attacked by the white pawn. And that's why we can capture it. Okay, so after c5, we can take it. This only works with pawns. You can't take any other piece en passant, only pawns. All right? I mean, don't go about taking queens and rooks and other pieces. I mean, you can only take pawns en passant and only when the enemy pawns have advanced 2 squares. Okay, so for example, here we take, black takes back, and now we're going to move that pawn forward 2 squares. Okay, but as you can see, the g3 square, when the pawn goes to g4 in one go, the black pawn can, in theory, take it. Only if he wants to. Okay, the en passant rule, if he wants to, he can take it. So this time he chooses to take it. And also don't forget that the en passant rule can only be applied right after your opponent has made his pawn move. Okay, here black can take the b pawn en passant. But if we make another move, like say d6, and then white goes f4, it's too late to take en passant. We can't take en passant anymore. It's too late. Our opportunity is gone. Okay, so you can only do it right after your opponent has made that move. Okay. And pawns are the soul of chess, and a pawn is worth approximately 1 point. But it depends, because sometimes, when the pawn is about to become a queen, how much is that pawn worth? A lot more, isn't it? So, as you can see, piece value is always relative. It depends on the position. Okay, that just about concludes our lesson today, and that's going to be the end of the lesson. And I'm going to leave you now with a quick lesson recap.